Picture this. A young man, barely 30 years old, standing on a balcony in Vienna, watching centuries of empire collapse beneath his feet. 6 weeks earlier, he had been the ruler of over 50 million people, sovereign of an empire that stretched from the Alps to the Carpathians, from Bohemia to the Balkans. Now, he is signing away his power, not quite abdicating, but stepping back from affairs of state in a document he hopes will let him return one day. He never gets to return. Within 4 years, he will be dead, exiled twice, starved of resources, dying of pneumonia on a damp island off the coast of Africa, thousands of miles from Vienna, from the palace of Schönbrunn, from the crown he wore for less than 2 years. This is the story of Karl I, the last emperor of Austria-Hungary, the final ruler of the Habsburg dynasty that governed parts of Europe for nearly 650 years. It is a story about how one of the oldest and most powerful royal houses in history ended not in a single dramatic fall, but in a slow, bewildering unraveling that left a young man with a wife and 8 children scrambling between borrowed houses, hostile governments, and failed coups, trying desperately to hold on to something that had already ceased to exist. And it is a story that almost nobody outside of Austria really knows. To understand what happened to Karl, you first need to understand just how enormous the thing was that collapsed around him. The Habsburgs were not just another royal family. They were, for centuries, the closest thing Europe had to a permanent ruling dynasty. Their rise began in the Middle Ages, in a small castle in what is now Switzerland, and through a relentless campaign of marriages, alliances, and inheritances rather than conquest, they expanded their holdings until they controlled Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, parts of Italy, the Netherlands, and for a period, Spain and its entire overseas empire as well. There was a saying about the Habsburgs, in Latin, "Let others wage war, but you, happy Austria, marry." It was not entirely a joke. The family's genius was not on the battlefield, it was in the marriage bed, and it built an empire on which for a time the sun genuinely never set. By the 19th century, the Habsburgs ruled over the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a sprawling, multi-ethnic state that included Austrians, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Ukrainians, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Slovenes, Italians, and Romanians, all under a single crown. It was an empire that, on paper, should not have worked. 11 official languages, a dozen distinct national identities, many of which increasingly wanted their own independent states rather than a place inside somebody else's. And yet for decades it held together, largely through the sheer stubborn longevity of one man, Emperor Franz Joseph, who took the throne in 1848 and remained on it for 68 years, long enough to become less a ruler and more a permanent fixture of European life, a man so old that most of his subjects could not remember a time when he had not been emperor. But underneath the surface, the empire was fraying badly. Nationalist movements were growing in Bohemia, in Croatia, in Serbia. The Hungarian half of the empire, which had won a large measure of self-government back in 1867, resented Vienna's continued control over foreign policy and the military. And into this already unstable structure came a series of personal tragedies that would eventually put Karl, a young man nobody expected to become emperor, directly in line for the throne. Franz Joseph's only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, died in a murder-suicide with his mistress in 1889, a scandal that rocked the empire to its core. That left the succession to Franz Joseph's brother's line, and specifically to the emperor's nephew, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And then, on the 28th of June 1914, in the streets of Sarajevo, a young Bosnian Serb nationalist named Gavrilo Princip stepped up to Franz Ferdinand's car and fired the shots that would set the entire continent on fire. Franz Ferdinand's death did not just remove the heir to the throne, it provided the spark for the First World War, and it moved a 27-year-old archduke named Karl, Franz Ferdinand's nephew, into position as the direct heir to one of the largest empires on Earth, at the exact moment that empire was about to be tested by the most catastrophic war in human history up to that point. Karl had been born on the 17th of August, 1887, at Persenbeug Castle in Lower Austria, the son of Archduke Otto Franz Joseph and Princess Maria Josepha of Saxony. He grew up in a household that, unlike so many royal families of the period, was genuinely warm and devout. Karl was raised in a strict Catholic tradition, And unlike his uncle Franz Ferdinand, who was a formal, prickly, difficult man, Karl was by most accounts gentle, unpretentious, and sincerely religious, the kind of person who prayed daily and took the moral responsibilities of kingship seriously rather than merely the ceremonial trappings of it. He trained as a military officer, as was expected of Habsburg princes, and in 1911 he married Princess Zita of Bourbon-Parma, a marriage that by all contemporary accounts was a genuine love match, not merely a dynastic arrangement, though it certainly served dynastic purposes as well. Zita would become one of the most important figures in Karl's life and in the story of what came after, a partner who stood beside him through every catastrophe still to come. When Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in 1914, Karl suddenly became heir apparent to the entire Austro-Hungarian throne. And then, just 2 years later, on the 21st of November, 1916, old Emperor Franz Joseph finally died after 68 years on the throne, and the crown passed to Karl. He was 29 years old, and he inherited an empire that was already 2 years deep into the First World War, bleeding men and resources on multiple fronts, its economy strained to breaking point, its ethnic tensions simmering dangerously close to the surface, and its military dependent almost entirely on its far stronger ally, Germany. Karl became emperor at possibly the single worst moment in the entire 6.5-century history of the Habsburg dynasty. And to his credit, Karl seemed to understand the scale of the crisis almost immediately. Unlike many European monarchs who continued pouring their populations into the meat grinder of the Western and Eastern fronts with grim resolve, Karl actually tried to get his empire out of the war. He initiated secret peace negotiations with the Allied powers through his brother-in-law, Prince Sixtus of Bourbon-Parma, hoping to broker a separate peace that would preserve Austria-Hungary's territorial integrity while ending the slaughter. The so-called Sixtus Affair, as it came to be known, was a bold and genuinely humane gesture. It was also a catastrophic political miscalculation. When the secret negotiations were exposed in 1918, largely because the French government leaked details to embarrass the Central Powers, Karl was humiliated internationally, accused of betraying his German ally, and forced into a deeply subordinate relationship with Kaiser Wilhelm and the German High Command for the remainder of the war. He had tried to save his empire from the war, and instead had weakened his own position within it. Karl also attempted domestic reforms that, in a different era, might have saved the monarchy. He tried to grant greater autonomy to the empire's various nationalities, floating plans to reorganize Austria-Hungary into a federal structure that would give Czechs, Poles, South Slavs, and others meaningful self-government within the imperial framework rather than full independence. But it was, by 1918, simply too late. The nationalist movements that had been building for decades had been supercharged by 4 years of war, by the collapse of the old European order, and by the promises of self-determination being made by Woodrow Wilson and the Allied powers. Nobody wanted federal autonomy anymore. They wanted their own countries. By the autumn of 1918, the empire was disintegrating in real time, province by province. Czechoslovakia declared independence in late October. The South Slav territories broke away to form what would eventually become Yugoslavia. Hungary began asserting its own separate path. Poland reconstituted itself as an independent state after over a century of partition. The vast multi-ethnic structure that the Habsburgs had spent centuries assembling through marriage and diplomacy came apart in a matter of weeks, not through any single decisive battle, but through a cascading series of declarations, each one making the next more inevitable. On the 11th of November, 1918, the same day the armistice was signed on the Western Front ending the First World War, Karl signed a proclamation relinquishing his participation in the affairs of State of Austria. It is a critical detail that this was not technically a formal abdication. Karl, deeply devout and genuinely convinced that his coronation had been a sacred God-given duty rather than a merely political office, refused to the end of his life to formally renounce his throne. He believed the crown was not his to give away. He could step back from exercising power, but the office itself, in his own mind, remained his by divine right, a belief that would go on to shape everything that happened to him over the following 4 years. 2 days later, he issued a similar declaration regarding Hungary. And with that, without a single formal abdication document, the reign of the Habsburgs, A dynasty that had ruled continuously in Central Europe since the Middle Ages effectively ended. Karl and his family did not immediately go into exile. For a time they remained at Schönbrunn Palace and then at Eckartsau Castle outside Vienna, in a kind of suspended, uncertain limbo, no longer ruling but not yet formally expelled either. It could not last. The new Austrian Republic, formed in the chaos of the empire's collapse, passed the Habsburg Law in the spring of 1919, a piece of legislation that stripped the family of all titles, confiscated the vast majority of their property and assets, and required any Habsburg who wished to remain in Austria to formally renounce all claims to the throne. Karl refused, and so, in March of 1919, Karl, Zita, and their children were forced out of Austria entirely, put aboard a train under the protection of British officers, and sent into exile in Switzerland. Switzerland should have been the end of the story, a quiet, uneventful exile like so many other deposed European royals experienced after the First World War. Kaiser Wilhelm, after all, simply settled into a comfortable estate in the Netherlands and lived out his days gardening and writing memoirs. But Karl was not built that way, and his unwavering belief that his crown remained sacred and legitimate pushed him towards something almost nobody expected. He tried to get it back. Twice. In the spring of 1921, with covert support from a handful of loyalists inside Hungary, Karl secretly traveled from Switzerland into Hungary, which at that point was ruled by a regent named Miklos Horthy, a former admiral who had been governing in Karl's name as a kind of caretaker monarchy without an actual monarch on the throne. Karl arrived in Budapest and attempted to simply resume his position as King of Hungary, appearing before Horthy and asking him to step aside. Horthy, whatever his formal loyalty to the Habsburg crown may once have been, refused. He had built his own power base in the intervening years and had no intention of surrendering it, and he was also acutely aware that the surrounding countries, freshly carved out of the collapsed empire, would view a Habsburg restoration as a direct existential threat and would very likely invade Hungary to prevent it. Karl's first restoration attempt collapsed within days, and he was quietly smuggled back out of the country. It should have been a lesson. It was not. In October of 1921, just months later, Karl tried again, this time far more boldly, actually flying into Western Hungary and rallying a small armed force of loyalist troops attempting to march on Budapest itself to seize power by force. It was, in retrospect, an almost absurdly reckless gamble, a man with no state, no real army, and no international backing, trying to physically retake a throne against the wishes of the government currently occupying it and against the far greater wishes of the surrounding Allied powers, who had spent years dismantling the Austro-Hungarian Empire specifically to prevent exactly this kind of Habsburg resurgence. Horthy's forces met Karl's small army near the town of Budors, just outside Budapest, and defeated them in a short, sharp battle. Karl was captured. This second attempt changed everything. The Allied powers and the newly formed Little Entente of Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Romania had watched the first failed coup with alarm and the second one with something close to fury. A restored Habsburg monarchy, even a limited one confined to Hungary, was seen as a mortal threat to the entire fragile new order of post-war Central Europe, a possible first step toward reassembling the empire that had just been so painstakingly dismantled. The Hungarian parliament, under enormous international pressure, formally dethroned the Habsburg dynasty once and for all. And the Allied powers made a decision about what to do with Karl that was, in its way, almost as brutal as anything the British had done to Bahadur Shah Zafar 60 years earlier on the other side of the world. They decided he could not simply return to Switzerland. He was too dangerous there, too close to Central Europe, too easy a rallying point for future restoration attempts. He needed to be sent somewhere remote, somewhere isolated, somewhere his name and his bloodline could do no further damage. They chose the island of Madeira, a small, remote volcanic outpost belonging to Portugal, sitting in the Atlantic Ocean hundreds of miles off the coast of Africa, closer to Morocco than to any part of continental Europe. It was, quite deliberately, about as far from the crumbling remains of his former empire as it was possible to send a man without shipping him across an ocean entirely. On the 19th of November, 1921, aboard a British warship, HMS Cardiff, Karl was taken from Hungary into exile for the second and final time. Zita and their children, who by this point numbered 8, followed shortly after. Madeira in 1921 was a beautiful place, but it was also poor, damp, and far from the medical infrastructure that a European royal family, even a deposed one, might have expected. The family's finances, already devastated by the confiscations back in Austria, were now in a state of near-total collapse. Karl had no income, no state, and very limited support from the handful of sympathetic monarchist networks still scattered around Europe. The family initially settled into a rented villa, but it proved too expensive to maintain, and within weeks they were forced to move into a much smaller and significantly less comfortable house called Quinta do Monte, high in the damp, cold hills above Funchal, the island's main town. It was, by any honest description, not a suitable dwelling for a man in fragile health, let alone for a family with young children. And Karl's health, it turned out, was about to become the central tragedy of the entire story. Not long after settling on the island, he went into Funchal on a shopping trip and was caught in the cold and damp weather, developing what began as what seemed to be an ordinary chest cold. It didn't stay ordinary. The illness progressed rapidly into bronchitis and then into pneumonia, and Karl's condition worsened with alarming speed. The house at Quinta do Monte, poorly heated and unsuited for treating serious illness, offered almost nothing in the way of adequate medical care. Doctors were summoned from the mainland, but by the time meaningful treatment could be arranged, Karl had also suffered a heart attack, his weakened body simply unable to withstand the combined strain of the pneumonia and the frantic, improvised medical response around him. Zita remained at his bedside throughout, along with their eldest son, the 8-year-old Archduke Otto, whom Karl reportedly insisted be brought into the room to witness his father's death, believing it was important for the future head of the House of Habsburg to understand, even as a child, the weight and the cost of what the family had lost. Karl died on the 1st of April, 1922, at the age of just 34, less than 4 years after losing his throne, less than 6 months after arriving on the island that would become his final home. He was the last Habsburg to have ever actually worn the imperial crown, and he died in a small rented villa on a remote Atlantic island, attended by a handful of doctors who had arrived too late, thousands of miles from Vienna, from Schönbrunn, from any palace his family had once called home. He was buried in the Church of Our Lady of Monte, overlooking Funchal, in a modest chapel that still receives visitors to this day. Zita, remarkably, lived for another 67 years after her husband's death, becoming something of a living monument to the vanished empire, raising their 8 children largely in exile and poverty across various European countries, never once remarrying and never once abandoning her belief in her husband's legitimacy as emperor. She died in 1989 at the age of 96, having outlived not only Karl by nearly 7 decades, but also having outlived the entire Cold War order that had reshaped Europe yet again in the years after her husband's brief doomed reign. She was buried in the Habsburg family crypt in Vienna, the Kaisergruft, the traditional resting place of Austrian emperors going back centuries, finally returning in death to the city she and Karl had been forced to flee. The Habsburg monarchy that Karl had refused to formally renounce never returned. Austria became and remained a republic. Hungary drifted through various forms of government before eventually becoming a republic itself. The vast multi-ethnic empire that had once stretched across Central Europe stayed permanently fragmented into the various nation-states that had broken away in 1918, states that in most cases still exist in roughly that form today. Karl's refusal to sign a formal abdication meant, in a strictly legal and theological sense according to his own beliefs and those of his most devoted followers, that the imperial crown never actually surrendered. It simply stopped being exercised by anyone at all. And yet, much like Bahadur Shah Zafar on the other side of the world 60 years earlier, there is a strange final twist to Karl's story, a kind of posthumous vindication that nobody at the time of his death could have predicted. In the decades after his death, a devotional movement began to grow around Karl within the Catholic Church, centered on his reputation for personal piety, his attempts to negotiate peace during the First World War, and his consistent efforts, however politically disastrous, to act according to his conscience rather than pure political calculation. Supporters began petitioning the Vatican for his formal recognition as a person of exceptional Christian virtue. Investigations were opened, miracles attributed to his intercession were examined, and in October of 2004, Pope John Paul II formally beatified Karl of Austria, declaring him Blessed Karl of Austria, one significant step below full sainthood in the Catholic Church, a recognition that placed the last emperor of a fallen dynasty into the formal veneration of one of the largest religious institutions on earth. It is an almost unbearably ironic ending when you sit with it. A man whose empire dissolved in a matter of weeks, who staged 2 failed coups to reclaim a throne nobody would give back to him, who died in a rented villa on a remote island at the age of 34 with almost nothing left to his name, would go on, 8 decades after his death, to be formally venerated by the Catholic Church as a figure of holiness. His tomb on Madeira transformed from an obscure grave into a site of pilgrimage, visited by monarchists, by Catholics, and by the curious, in exactly the same way the British-imposed grave of Bahadur Shah Zafar eventually became a site of pilgrimage they had specifically tried to prevent. The Habsburg dynasty that had ruled for nearly 650 years, that had assembled an empire through the careful accumulation of marriages rather than conquest, ended not with a dramatic execution or a bloody uprising, but with a quiet, bewildered young man, forced from his palace, exiled twice, defeated twice, dying of an ordinary illness in an inadequate house on a remote island, refusing until his final breath to admit that the crown he believed was sacred had truly been lost. Karl never got his empire back. He never got Vienna back. He never even really got to live a full life, dying at 34 with a widow and 8 children, scattered by circumstance across a Europe that had permanently, irrevocably moved on without him. But his name endures. His descendants still exist today as private citizens with a quiet but persistent connection to Austrian public life, and his grave on that small Atlantic island, much like the grave the British tried so hard to erase in Rangoon, became in the end exactly the kind of monument that history so often builds for the people it was supposed to forget. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please leave a comment below and let me know what you think. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. It truly helps more than you know. I'll see you in the next one.